Thank you very much. We're continuing actually with the same department. We've referred to Professor Daniel Abrams now in the last two lectures, and he's probably had in the shortest description of what to read about him, because I assume that everybody here knows him and all his work. So we know he is was a Department of Jewish Thought professor at Bar-Ilan University. He published, among others, Sefer Gematliot with Israel Tashma and Eleazar of Worms, and Jacob Cohen's commentaries on Ezekiel with Asif Barber. He published a lot more. He's also the editor of Kabbalah and a lot of other things. But I'm not going to steal his time and let you hear his lecture on an unknown manuscript source of the Hermeneutic Gates by Rabbi Eleazar of Worms, a response to the death of Rabbi heHasid.
I would like to thank the organizers of this fine conference and for assembling a very rich group of investigations, Sefer Hasidim, from a variety of perspectives. Before I begin my talk, I would like to add that there is no greater pleasure for me than to be part of a conference and a session where a student of mine presents the freedom for research and with such erudition. A very proud advisor stands before you today. I turn now to my talk, an unknown manuscript source of the Hermeneutic Gates of Eleazar of Worms. Many years ago, I published an article entitled The Literary Emergence of Esotericism in German Pietism, which focused on Sefer HaChochmah, or at least texts attributed to Rabbi Eleazar of Worms. That study appeared in 1994 in 3 languages. The English and Hebrew versions, which appeared in the journals Shofar and Machanaim, were my doing, and the French translation, which appeared in the journal Pardes, was the work of Charles Mopsing. Nevertheless, this was possibly overdone for a scholar at the beginning of his career. Even so, I mustered up all the evidence I had found at the time to show that Rabbi Eleazar of Worms indeed had students who orally received esoteric traditions from him, and who were active in continuing the literary chain of transmission of the Kolonimite school, despite his claims to the contrary. Eleazar was thus not the last link of oral transmission from Rabbi Shmuel to Rabbi Samuel to Rabbi Judah the Pious and on to Rabbi Eleazar of Worms. In the study, I interrogated a very telling autobiographical passage from Rabbi Eleazar's Sefer HaChochmah, in which he bemoaned the death of his teacher, Rabbi Judah the Pious, in 1217, and defended with stated regret his perceived need to break from the strictures of esotericism to which he was bound when he was inducted into the chain of tradition heralded by his teacher, Rabbi Judah the Pious. It should be noted that Rabbi Eleazar was the first representative in this chain who was not the son of his teacher, and was chosen over Rabbi Judah's son. Although not explicit, the passage in Sefer Chochmah presents itself as the first act of writing following the death of Rabbi Judah, and in the autobiographical account, Rabbi Eleazar tells of the death of his son and the lack of any students who could continue the chain in the next generation. Rabbi Eleazar therefore offered an argument for beginning his literary project, which is apologetic, since he purportedly did not wish to break his promise of keeping the secrets as part of an oral exchange within a closed circle of adepts. In light of the evidence, I uncovered that indeed there was a circle of younger students, and read this passage with suspicion, stopping short of the suggestion that Rabbi Eleazar was knowingly inventing the pretext in order to excuse himself before his readership, knowing full well that it was unnecessary to commit the trove of traditions he possessed to writing, and could do so with impunity, only as a result of the death of Rabbi Judah the Pious. A softer reading of the same passage would have Rabbi Eleazar wrestling with his moral sense and trying to convince himself by an argument, however contrived, that indeed there were sufficient conditions to implement his long-held wish to write, given the present circumstances. Either way, the suggestion I was toying with at the time was that Eleazar did not mask so well his feeling of his possible resentment of the restrictions set out by his teacher, who would not recognize his creative and literary potential. And it was only now, upon the death of Rabbi Judah, that Rabbi Eleazar could fulfill his vision of self and self-appointed mission as the literary voice of the esoteric movement. In this light, we might also read with some suspicion the historical record of the transfer of esoteric lore in Eleazar's commentary to the prayers, which provided an impressive list of names going back many generations and concluding with himself. So while I do not wish to claim or dispel the accuracy and authenticity of this record, which is nevertheless irrelevant for our present purposes, except to the extent that it possibly was sincerely offered by Rabbi Eleazar, and this I do not doubt, as even my suspicion has its limits. I would like to reconsider the function or need of this account in Rabbi Eleazar's writing, possibly as a marker of his own discomfort. In other words, given his break with this form of esotericism and his own self-awareness of innovation, it seemed that he needed to assert his authority as one who preserves and transfers. To provide a broader context, we might consider similar cases in the history of Jewish mysticism, such as Isaac the Blind's comments about oral transmission and writing in light of his former students living in Gerona, the break of esotericism by the various students of Nachmanides, and Rabbi Chaim Vital's account of Isaac Gloria's appointment of Chaim Vital as his sole literary voice, if that event ever happened, and the hagiographic account of Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov regarding the demon holding a volume of a written record of his sayings. It is here that we can turn to the context of Sefer HaChochmah and offer a contextualized reading of the meaning of 73 shi'arim, or hermeneutical devices of German pietism, that were summarized in this short text. These keys are offered in a moment of crisis, or purport to have been constructed at such a time, lest Rabbi Eleazar, as the last authoritative representative of the movement, not survive long enough to execute the literary program and write out the full range of interpretations in discursive form. And even though Eleazar would live long enough to compose thousands of folios of esoteric texts, we must ask whether there is any correspondence between this theoretical summary and the other texts he penned. Joseph Don first published a study of this work in Sion, volume 29, 1964, and it reappeared in his later collected studies volume and in various later rewritten forms. In this and subsequent studies, he argued there is only one work which used these keys, shi'arim, as the structure or guide to interpretation, a commentary to the Torah, written by a student of Rabbi Eleazar, but printed under his name, under the name of Eleazar, along with Sefer HaChochmah, from Oxford Oppenheimer 27, 268, and published in Braid and Bauer between the years 1979 and 1981. Don concluded that the program is obviously not theoretical since it was implemented by one figure, a student of Eleazar, but definitely not Eleazar himself. Kiryat Sefer, volume 69, page 644, a terse but most fine bibliographic discussion. But this question skirts the troubling subject of Rabbi Eleazar's self-awareness and the intentions that could or should be attributed to this list of hermeneutic keys, the reasons behind the composition of Sefer HaChochmah, and the relationship between these texts and the other writings of Rabbi Eleazar. Today I am tempted to suggest an even more suspicious engagement with this text, and takes Don's observation one step further. There is very little relationship between the style and genres of Eleazar's other writing and the literary program detailed in the Gates and Sefer HaChochmah. And since only this one student seems to show any close affinity with this text, it could be argued that he wrote both and projected it upon his teacher. Namely, he wrote up the text as the composition of Rabbi Eleazar. A softer position may be that here we have traditions or oral lessons of Rabbi Eleazar which break down the binary of authentic versus fabricated. And so Sefer HaChochmah, whether penned and finalized in writing by Rabbi Eleazar or not, might have come from his mind, teaching, or some version that he committed to writing. But my suggestion here, at the very least, is that the simplest explanation is that both Sefer HaChochmah and the commentary to the Torah attributed to Rabbi Eleazar should be grouped together and juxtaposed to the rest of the literary program of writings known to be the product of Rabbi Eleazar. Let me be clear that this is an argument offered with textual evidence, even though it could not convince a skeptic. Rather, my assessment is one that offers the simplest possible explanation given a complex setting that does not lend itself to a smooth negotiation with all the textual evidence under the rubric of a single narrative. Before turning to the details of the 73 gates or hermeneutic keys, I would like to engage a topic that escaped earlier scholarship, namely, the meaning and function of writing for the German pietists. So while I have utilized a rather simplistic binary of preservation and innovation in my remarks thus far, correlating basically to oral and written transmission, I realize that the incorporation of self-awareness and historical consciousness complicate the matter far beyond what I have offered just now, and are occasioned by the introduction of books and the entrance of the author and free-form literary creation produced in Hebrew for the first time in the Middle Ages. Much has been written on the pietist ethos of humility and the insistence of not attaching one's name to a written document, marking a difference between Rabbi Judah and Rabbi Eleazar, where the latter would flagrantly include his name according to various literary devices. But returning to the question of what is a composition and the intentional construction and composition of a book, quotes, book, by a named author, we must say that the first full-length book written in Hebrew, with its own literary structure, or books with their own literary structure and identity, are variously the products of the 12th and 13th centuries, namely Ibn Ezra, Sod Marah, Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, and Eleazar of Worms. All other so-called books, like Sefer Hasidim, are transcriptions of oral teachings, older vestiges of folklore, anthologies, or texts which have been highly edited and appear to have been, from their inception, compilations and not intentional acts of writing structured works of literature. And when that fails, it seems that even when a single person penned a single version of a text, what has survived is a later copy that shows great intervention by copyists and students. And if we were to ignore for the moment the linear progression of literary history of Hebrew literature and focus on the Ashkenazim and the Kolonimite circle, it would seem that Eleazar truly saw himself, or to put it more carefully, the literary figure behind or presented as responsible for Sefer HaChokhmah, saw himself in this work as the incipient moment of writing of pietistic esotericism, a new and apparently necessary phenomenon. Here we should pause and ask whether the list of the gates was pre-existent and the book or work was composed to buttress this list. I would like to push my skepticism one step further and question whether the systematization or enumeration of the range of hermeneutic techniques as central principles of exegesis was a move to restrict the category, to restrict creativity, by capturing and preserving what was undertaken by a previous generation, or whether it was contrived by Eleazar to appear as such in order to free himself from the restraint of a specific body of traditions he received, and thus it might mark the beginning of his own creative period. The latter possibility would at least explain or accord with the turn we see in other works, such as Sodei Raziah. Of course, there always remains the possibility that Eleazar did not even write any text of what is found in Sefer HaChokhmah in any of the versions, or that scholarship is completely misconceived of the chronology of Rabbi Eleazar's writings, and that he wrote down and edited the traditions of his teacher, Rabbi Judah, even before 1217, and possibly composed his own works too at an earlier date. As should be apparent by now, the evidence available raises more questions than answers, and the available methodologies and subjects of interest further complexify any inquiry. And yet, I stand before you as someone who denies authorship as a meaningful category for the interpretation of most all Jewish mystical texts, at least relative to the engagement with such texts, devoid of any pretension of using texts as works that instrumentally reflect back upon the personality of a historical figure. The case of German pietism and Rabbi Eleazar is a most pertinent example, since revision in the norm is the norm and not the exception, and one would be hard-pressed to offer any particular manuscript or even reconstruction between various manuscripts as an original that could be used to adduce authorial intent. So even where a general or fuzzy assessment could be offered, the question is not if such a claim could be defended, but rather, is such an interest the best use of the material for the understanding of how the texts work, given what has survived? And now we can turn to the manuscripts of Sefer HaChokhmah. From the early work of Gershom Shalom and Joseph Don, and on to the studies of Asi Farber, Moshe Idel, Eli Wilson, and myself, scholars have noted the so-called proto-Kabbalistic terminology within Sefer HaChokhmah, attributed therein to Sefer Yirkach. The debate among scholars turned to whether Eleazar understood the text he cited within his work, or whether it was an act of mechanical copying which obfuscated any acknowledgement of a precedent to theosophic or sexualized symbolism, which would mark the emergence of Kabbalah taking place in adjacent lands around that time. I wish to comment that in the 1980s and 1990s, scholarship was seduced, and I say this in the most positive sense, by the possibility that Kabbalah did not emerge as a sudden revolution, but was based on earlier precedents, in accord with Moshe Dell's phenomenology of reconstruction. More recently, David Siegel published a penetrating study that exposed a major oversight that should have been apparent to the academic community that knows so much about these texts. He pointed out that all the manuscripts were late and that they were reworked at a much later time. Moshe Dell has since identified and shared with me that in Manuscript, Oxford, Oppenheim 614, Neubauer 2275, folios 31b to 33a, the Kabbalistic commentary which served as the source for these interpolations, which is Sefer HaChokhmah, and which were attributed to Eleazar of Worms. I thank him for discussions on this matter, and we have agreed to put together a volume of this text with his and my new findings and all the known materials of Sefer HaChokhmah in order to present the full context and record, the career of this work. These discoveries are considerable and amount to major moments in the history of esoteric terminology and the vicissitudes of a text and work which have been clarified. All this does not discount that within these texts, in their later form, in some work or textual formulations, go back to the desk of Rabbi Eleazar of Worms and early 13th century German pietism. What has been lacking is an Ashkenazi manuscript from an early period, such as the 13th or 14th centuries, which present Sefer HaChokhmah, or at least the gates, to provide evidence for what has been assumed to have been earlier. And so, in a 14th century commentary to the Torah, which itself is built around a collection of material, including attributions to Rabbi Judah and Rabbi Eleazar of Worms, I found a listing of the gates. The manuscript is in Jerusalem. It belongs to the Ben-Zvi Institute, manuscript number 2. And yet I was not able to view the manuscript, but relied solely on the microfilm, found 2 floors below. The manuscript was copied in Ashkenazi script in 1341. It is connected to the Aleppo Codex and came to Jerusalem from the Jewish community in Syria, and is now housed in the Israel Museum and requires so many permissions to view and or film that the microfilm must suffice for now. Indeed, I could offer a lecture on the irony of the failed efforts of a scholar living in Jerusalem to view a manuscript housed in a public institution in the capital city. I will state only that I made significant efforts and spoke to the relevant librarians, but to no avail. As to the text viewed in microfilm, the listing begins on folio 369a and begins with the words, "I will begin with the collection of the gates that Rabbi Eleazar, may his memory be blessed, established, and collections from our teacher, Rabbi Judah the Pious, may the memory of the saint be blessed. These are the gates, She'arim, and they are, and now in Hebrew, Achil Likutei She'arim, She'asad Harav Eleazar Zal, Likutei, Moreno Harav, Rabbi Yehuda Hasid Zatzal, Chokhmah She'arim," that's the Gematria 73, Hen Elu Hen. It should be noted that there is no complete uniformity of the number or order of the gates across the various manuscript witnesses, as in Oxford 1567, 299a, Oxford 1812, 109b, and 1568, folio 24b. And I flew to Oxford and was able to read from the manuscripts myself. A true joy. The text is important not only because of the variation, but because it appears outside of the literary context of Sefer HaChokhmah and the so-called proto-Kabbalistic interpolations, which we now know were added at a later time. Here we have more evidence of an attribution to Eleazar, and for the first time from an Ashkenazi manuscript copied within a century or so of the passing of Rabbi Eleazar, offering more certain historical grounds for the dating of some of these traditions. Does this mean that Eleazar is the first and only figure to write down and or use these gates? Not necessarily. But note that the attribution here presents a pair of sources, and not necessarily integrated, of Rabbi Eleazar and of Rabbi Judah. Scholarship has been too focused on authorship and attribution to delineate the differences between the two figures behind the ideas, texts, and styles of writing, which runs in the face of the statements in the text themselves, the claims of Rabbi Eleazar that he received material from Judah, and in a very real way posthumously served as his literary secretary, even as I tried to show the degree of innovation, and finally what scholars find in the texts themselves. In the same article I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, I argued for the editorial hand of Rabbi Eleazar in at least one passage of Sefer Hasidim. And this possibility should not be summarily dismissed. My point is to produce discomfort with clear categories and dispense with the identity of the work and the author, which, as should be obvious by now, to anyone who reads manuscripts of Jewish mystical texts, but more powerfully, fluidity and revision are arguably the most characteristic features of this body of literature. Rabbi Eleazar's hand in what he penned, including what he wrote down from the words of others, oral or written, and the rewriting of his own texts in new texts that are not necessarily different works, only show that the problems are not in these documents, but in our own thinking and trying to box them into monocategories. I have chosen to read Eleazar's claims of suspicion and skepticism, but I think this is healthy now and in this case. But against the grain, I would suggest that Eleazar's obsession with incorporating his name in various writings, an act that was continued by others to refer to Eleazar, whether he was connected to the text or not, might point to the very opposite of his authority and the originary point of creativity, at least in terms of self-awareness. Thus I offer for your consideration, the Rebbe Judah the Pious may be more present in texts that do not state his name, including those attributed to Rebbe Eleazar, than Rebbe Eleazar is in the text he claims for himself by his own name. But this is no doubt my critical resistance to simplistic categories, and these texts are anything but simple. In the case of Sefer HaChochmah, more detailed comparisons need to be done in a Hebrew study with the text. In my comments today, my limited aim was to present a new source, reconsider the known evidence, and suggest an alternative solution to the question of authorship in accordance with questions of self-awareness, suspicion, and the fuller picture of literary esotericism amongst the German pietists.